Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Fighting regional opponents may be Joseph Parker's best bet, according to his former promoter and current manager and advisor, David Higgins, who was speaking to Pep Talk UK. And this was a varied chat with Pep Talk UK. There was some discussion about a potential rematch with Dillian Whyte. But that sort of thing for me, I'm not going to get into that in this video because it's a bit old hat. I think it really is not going to happen anytime soon. Whyte might sort of trash talk Parker, and Parker has responded on social media recently. See here on screen. This is what he was saying in response to a few barbs from Dillian Whyte. But ultimately, it's not going to happen, in my view, the rematch, that is, until Dillian Whyte loses. He's not interested in running that back right now. That's been evident for quite some considerable time, and I've said I don't think it's going to happen until Whyte loses. But this interview with Pep Talk UK, the other stuff regarding potential options for Parker, but some of the way that it's been talked about in the framing of it now, and some of it being talked about regarding coronavirus and potential lifting and regional opponents, it is a shift, and not a subtle one, quite a marked shift from David Higgins, from some statements he's just made in recent weeks. And I'll get to that. So in terms of the interview proper, Higgins said, if there is no fights in the UK for 6 months or a year, what does Joseph Parker do? And he went on to say, and this is just summing it up here, he had to consider regional matchup options. And he mentioned by name Junior Fa, Lucas Browne, and Demsey McKean, who he actually called Demsey McLean, but, I knew who he was meaning. And if you don't know who McKean is, he's an up-and-coming Australian fighter, just had his best win at the start of March against Johnny Rice, a final round stoppage in a very back-and-forth, entertaining fight. But Higgins said, you fight who you can fight. And the current situation right now, it really is uncertain. So a lot of countries are in lockdown. New Zealand, where I am, is currently at lockdown at the time that I'm recording this video. So who knows when restrictions and other bits and pieces will be lifted and we get back to some semblance of normality. But what Higgins was saying in regards to the way he was talking about potential opponents, it was a definite shift in positioning, because remember, talk of the Junior Fa fight, for example, it didn't just emerge during the lockdown, but immediately after the Shaundale Winters fight at the end of February. Eddie Hearn mentioned it. David Higgins eventually went on to talk about Junior Fa, and the way he was sort of selling it was as a huge domestic fight between two top heavyweights, and he was hugely complimentary of Fa. But now the line is, and now that we're in this sort of situation, that Fa is one of the few options that could be available, because we don't know when travel restrictions, for example, are going to be lifted. The New Zealand border is closed right now. You can't just catch a flight out to different parts in the world. And we don't know how long that's going to continue, and restrictions could be in place for some time. There has been some sort of talk in the sort of New Zealand media, at least, that perhaps with the close relationship with Australia, and obviously being the country next door, maybe there will be like a shared bubble, as it's sort of being mentioned, between the two countries to allow some movement for travellers. And remembering, a lot of New Zealanders live in Australia. And if they did have that sort of thing, that could possibly open up some options for a fight. And this is obviously why David Higgins is mentioning the names Australians, Lucas Browne and Demsey McKean. I do have a bit of an issue with some of the thinking around New Zealand being one of the first countries to potentially open back up to big events. I actually think that's quite a short-sighted and presumptuous view, because New Zealand has currently some of the strictest lockdown measures in place. Those restrictions are still in place right now, a level 4 lockdown, as it were. There is going to be a staged approach to getting back to some sort of place called normal. So while from the outside looking in, New Zealand might look like it's flattening the curve of corona, etc., I don't think anyone can just assume that big events are resuming anytime soon, especially judging by the current strict conditions that will persist likely for some time. If they've been super cautious so far, what makes people think that they're just going to abandon that and just, hey, we're going to let people have big events now? If anything, New Zealand might not allow gatherings of any real size for a considerable length of time, possibly longer than other countries. We're already hearing talk that some American states are starting to look at, Florida, for example, holding different events. There's no such talk of that in New Zealand. So, in my view, some of the talk from Higgins is highly optimistic, as was Junior Fa's manager Mark Cadell recently saying that a Parker and Fa fight could be among the first big sporting events for the world to see. I think that really is looking at the situation and hoping for the absolute best when it probably isn't going to occur. I don't think New Zealand is going to be one of the first countries to allow, mass events back. And if they do, it's probably going to be in 2021, not in the next couple of months. Some people seem to be thinking that. But just looking at some of these names that have been mentioned by Higgins, obviously Junior Fa covered that off in a number of recent videos, so not sure how much ground we really have to go over on that one. At the moment, you know my view, it's a fight that's largely undercooked. Sure, there's some rankings that they share in different sanctioning bodies, but it's not a fight that people are absolutely baying for and demanding right now. And I think for people to say that that is going to be a massive fight with massive international exposure, that's also, looking at the glass as not half full, but overflowing. The other options, Lucas Browne, I don't know how much, people would really be interested in that at this point. 3 years ago, remember, before he signed to fight Anthony Joshua, that fight with Browne was almost made. Browne had signed his end of the deal. But at that point, he was unbeaten. He hadn't been knocked out by Dillian Whyte. He hadn't been stopped by Dave Allen. He hadn't looked terrible in a number of tune-up fights, which he has. So at this point, for an over-the-hill Browne who's 40 plus, yeah, it's not something that I would be wanting to see. And he doesn't have any rankings right now, so it doesn't really make any sense. But this is why Higgins is finessing the message now. He's looking to do that because if you pitch it, remembering what I was saying earlier, as Junior Fa, Joseph Parker, big domestic dust-up, going to be huge and yada, 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 fans will look at that fight with that lens in that certain sort of way that it's been described. But if you change the narrative, as Higgins is seemingly trying to do, as this is the best of the options available, what do you expect Joseph Parker to do? You can kind of look at the situation through that lens and it feels just slightly different. It might be, the best of a bad situation effectively. But Browne would be certainly the worst of a worse situation in my view at this point. Browne doesn't have anything to offer Joseph Parker except a cheap win, and it's not a fight I would want to see. And certainly I don't think many people, boxing fans that is, some casuals might get hooked in, but do we want to see him get brutally knocked out again? Because that is what is going to happen. And Dempsey McKean, it also sort of falls into that Junior Fa sort of boat in terms of he's an unbeaten fighter, but really doesn't have a lot on the resume. He's still building his record. His most recent win was against a gatekeeper level guy in Jonathan Rice. It was a fun fight, entertaining, but there's levels. Fa and McKean haven't really sort of, gone through all the requisite sort of levels they need to get that Parker fight. It would be a step too far, a step too soon for both of those guys, in my view. And if people aren't really looking at these fights as being maybe, the fights he should be in, Joseph Parker, and maybe don't see them as super competitive, what does that do for Joseph Parker in his career? People are already complaining that he's had 3 consecutive tune-ups after 2 losses to Joshua and Whyte. So, yeah, there is a bit of spin here from David Higgins, obviously starting to look at let's pitch this as a Corona-related, we could have a regional matchup type fight, as opposed to just when he was talking about Fa initially. Remember, Higgins and this talk of Fa started before the real bad stuff started coming with the lockdown, and at that point it was pitched as this is going to be a massive fight, people are going to get so invested in this. But I don't know who was really buying that at the time, and seemingly he's decided to discard that narrative for now and go with a new one. And just before I go, it's worth mentioning as well, Higgins did talk about Junior Fa and Joseph Parker in the context of Joseph Parker would be willing to face Fa for $500,000 New Zealand dollars. So I guess that sort of raises the question, would Junior Fa be effectively willing to take that? They were talking about for 1/3 for $250,000. You have to ask that question. But also, if it is sinking down to that level, Does that mean that Joseph Parker and David Higgins, and Liam, thank you for raising this in another comment section, does that mean that this wouldn't be part of Parker's DAZN contract if he's willing to drop down to that sort of level of pay? Because reportedly he had been getting about $2 million New Zealand per fight under a 3-fight DAZN deal. Maybe this will be sort of carved out and set aside as a Joseph Parker, David Higgins, do your own thing for this next fight. You've still got one fight left when you come back to America at some point. It's a possibility. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.